The frontal lobe can cause executive functioning deficits.
Yeah, you hear a lot about, I guess, in fact, probably 80% of what you hear about frontal lobe injury talks about executive functioning deficits. And that is fairly easy to understand if you think of the brain as the head of an organization. Much like a CEO is the head of a corporation, the frontal lobes are the head of your, not just your brain, but your body. When you have executive functioning deficits, it's the CEO that's messed up. Now, frontal lobe injuries are far more complicated than just that executive functioning model to describe it, but it does involve significant disruption in the way in which your brain's and your body's resources are managed, planned, and choices are made.
Okay, so difficulties with complex processing.
Yeah, I mean, again, the more human, the more higher human, the more adult, the later in maturation you do a function, the more likely that function is being done by the frontal lobes, and damage to the frontal lobes will interfere with it.
The same would be like for mood and emotions?
Now this is again dealing with not the classic frontal lobe injury you hear about, but major portions of the mood centers, major portions of the behavior centers. Most of those adult behaviors, those manners we learn, the inhibitions and the disinhibition problems, they come from frontal lobes, and it's the frontal lobes that are developing between 10 and 25 when we learn to be adults, when we learn how to get along better with others, how to woo members of the opposite sex, how to behave sexually, socially, and in work situations. So if it's something that you learn better as you get older, and 12, 15, 20, it's all likely the frontal lobe that's going to be affected by those things.
Okay, so that would involve things like insight, decision making.
Decision making is one of those things that involves so much cognitive processing, because decisions are rarely simple. I mean, if you're talking about a forced choice, yes or no, I have to go left or right, perhaps it's simple and doesn't involve that much of your brain. But the more differential choices involved, like a differential diagnosis for a doctor, the more differential options that you have, the more of your brain, of your memory, of those things you've learned about behavior have to be considered. And it's considering those things that typically involves frontal lobe injury, but not just the cerebral cortex of the frontal lobe, but also all of the communication axonal aspects, the tracts of the frontal lobe as well. We think in terms of the frontal lobe as this big mass of gray matter. And it is the largest part of gray matter in our body. But the frontal lobes also have commensurate white matter. And the white matter in the frontal lobes is probably more vulnerable to injury than the gray matter, except in a very severe injury. Because besides the size of the frontal lobes, because of the location of the frontal lobes, they're very susceptible to being twisted. And so it's not just a question of gray matter, it's also white matter injury.